Namaste, yogis. How are you? Welcome to our very special international Meet a Yogi with our guest, Petri Berndtson. Welcome, Petri.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you for coming here all the way from Finland today.
Well, through internet, it's pretty fast.
Yes, not too much travel required. And also we have Joe Robertson on, who is our resident expert in breathwork. He was the person who connected me to Petri, and we wanted to have him on so that we could share a little bit about what he's learning about breathwork too. This topic today is Mind Your Breath, Create a Conscious Life. And Petri Berndtson is the inventor of philosophical breathwork. And we're going to learn a little bit about this technique of philosophical breathwork. It's a method which transforms, mutates, and deepens all phenomena into respiratory phenomena. Using this technique, you can investigate experientially the fundamental philosophical questions of space, time, freedom, community, selfhood, body, language, peace, spirituality, the world, and being through your embodied experience of breathing. And so, Petri, thank you so much for being here. I would love to hear a little bit about this breathwork technique. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the actual technique that you do? It's
well,
like a lot of technique. Like there's a lot that you can do.
Well, I take the word breathwork very literally here, because breathwork, of course, literally means to work with the breath. So in a certain way, we could say that anything we do with the breath, if we are working with it or playing with it or investigating experientially with it, we are doing breath work. And of course, then there are plenty of different kind of breathwork techniques, as we know, holotropic breathwork or rebirthing breathwork or therapeutic breathwork and all kinds of forms and styles of breathwork. And in a sense, then we could call that my idea of philosophical breathwork is one of these styles. But I would also say that when it's a philosophical method, the idea is also try to get to the beginning of what does it actually mean to work with the breath, and what could be the possibilities and dimensions that we could do when we are working with the breath. And as philosophy is art of wonder, learning to wonder the world again, we could think that philosophical breath work is that you are not yet connected to any ready-made technique or style of breath work like holotropic breath work, where you already have certain kind of vocabulary and certain kind of goals of finding, for example, non-ordinary states of consciousness or something like this. And that's what you are aiming at. And then there is certain kind of methods of drawing the mandalas after the... And of course, all these are extremely interesting possibilities of breath. Or then the rebirthing breath work has a certain kind of vocabulary and certain kind of beliefs and so on. But when we are doing philosophical breath work, then the idea would be to learn again to wonder the breath without any preconceptions, trying to get into that kind of experience of breath as like from the beginning as possible, without having any kind of preconception or pre-knowledge of what we are doing here. It's more like starting the journey again with the breath, and then creating this kind of atmosphere with the experience of breathing. And then you can start to bring any kind of thing or phenomenon of life or any questions of life, not only philosophical questions or those questions which we normally think as particularly philosophical questions of life, but any kind of questions of life, any kind of phenomena, any kind of matters of living, and try to think and experience and examine what they could be, how they would appear to us if we would feel them, think them, experience them within experiential atmosphere of breathing.
Like it's literally your technique. It's literally breath inquiry, that the technique is to be curious about what you will discover with the breath, rather than, and you mentioned these other breathwork techniques, and I just, for people who aren't as familiar with these things, that these techniques that you're mentioning are ones where you're sort of manipulating the breath. You're basically hyperventilating in order to get yourself into these sort of, unusual experiences that aren't part of our day-to-day states of mind. And so when you're talking about things like holotropic breath work, where you're sort of deliberately putting yourself into an altered state of consciousness through breath, you're saying no against that, then this is more of, it's just correct, it's more of a approaching, what am I going to find in my breath with a sense of wonder. Is that correct?
Well, it's partially correct, because this can mean that you're also using holotropic techniques, or you're using rebirthing techniques, or yoga techniques, or techniques of Buddhism, mindfulness of breathing, or whatever you are doing. But you are putting aside all, you're kind of putting out of play or placing in abeyance all the ready-made vocabularies, the ready-made ways of understanding, where somebody else has already kind of put that conceptual framework to you of how you should understand and what you should be looking for in this method. So it's more like returning whatever technique you are using. You can play with all kinds of techniques, but then you need to kind of like start to think from the beginning of all the possibilities. Is first of all, you notice that you're using certain kind of technique. You are manipulating your breath. And then you understand that when you manipulate your breath, it will create different kind of experiences or different kind of results compared to if you are not manipulating your breath. And then you see that these two are, for example, these two are possibilities of breath. Breath gives us a possibility to just let it be and then be as conscious of it as possible, but it also lets itself be manipulated, and that's another kind of possibility of breathing. And then, so this is, for example, to become as conscious as possible of all kinds of different kind of possibilities of breath and all these different kinds of methods, but then also notice that these methods themselves are only possible because we have the breath there, the experience of breath there, which then we can manipulate further. So, for example, this is one important aspect of understanding the possibilities and dimensions of breath, and then I would call this already getting yourself back into certain kind of philosophical wonder of the possibilities of breath.
This really gets into what my question is that I was bringing to this conversation with you that so intrigued me, which is we've had, for example, Joe has come on here several times talking about breath work and sort of getting people, generally when we ask sort of the question of like, why are we working with the breath? Why is it that so many different meditation techniques work with the breath? Why is it that so many people discover through their own inquiry that that connection to the breath, that fundamental connection to the breath, brings that experience of release, of peace, of calm. And mostly when people that I've interviewed or spoken to have talked about why do we work with the breath, they give a biological explanation, which is that the diaphragm is the only muscle in our body that we can control both consciously and autonomically. And so that it's sort of this doorway into the unconscious mind. But your work so intrigued me because you were saying that not to say that you weren't talking about that at all, but that you were also looking at the fact that this is how we experience just our fundamental experience of what is peace comes through our embodied experience of breathing. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about this aspect of your work, because it's not to say it's another viewpoint on breath work that I have not heard before.
Okay, before I go to that, I want to say something which is important on what you were saying. Why so many traditions turn to breathing, and then you connected it with biological aspect of understanding diaphragm in a certain kind of way. So when I said earlier that philosophical breathwork is returning to the wonder of the breath, or then we could also talk about the mystery of the breath or the miracle of breath, to become wondrous again, like almost like childlike wonderos about the experience of breathing. And then that this wondrous aspect comes when we put aside all kind of ready-made conceptual frameworks. And for example, of different kind of methods of breath work, or then the yoga systems conceptual framework, or the Buddhist. This also includes the scientific, which biological framework belongs to the natural scientific conceptual system. So we also, in philosophical breath work, we put aside, we put out of play for a moment also the natural scientific or any kind of scientific frame of mind or ways to see or conceptualize the world. And because that we don't experience that what biology or the physiology or any other natural science tells us about the world or about our breath or of our bodily way of behaving in the world. So, for example, nobody has ever experienced in our own experience oxygen or cells that they talk about, cellular respiration, or nobody has ever experienced in our brainstem what controls the breathing, the breathing center there, or none of this. So then
these are autonomic systems that we cannot access consciously.
Well, we experience that things are happening. The breath is going and coming. Something we are experiencing, something which is autonomous in sense that we can control it, but it happens also. It takes place within us. It happens as a relationship between us and the world. And then we can control it. That's a possibility of that breath. But in the first place, breath is an experience of something that just takes place. It is a certain kind of event that happens. But from there, then we get to this point of why could it be that so many traditions turn into breath? For example, so many Eastern wisdom traditions. The question is here, in my opinion, that breath compared to, for example, to our perceptual way of being in the world, our senses of seeing, touching, grabbing things, and so on, is that our perception is connected with things and objects. We see visible things, but air that we are connected through the breath is something invisible. It is not an object. It is not a thing, but it is an atmosphere. And that's why, for example, our book is also called The Atmospheres of Breathing. So the connection with the breath is like all the senses connect us with the things and, for example, with material objects. But the breath connects us with the invisible atmosphere, something which is that invisible atmosphere is certain kind of openness. It is the open air. It is the free air, something which doesn't block us, doesn't obstruct us, like the things in front of us. For example, they obstruct our vision. We can't see through other things, what is behind them. We can't hear very well if there is walls between you and me and so on. I can't touch other things. I can't go through things and so on. But air is something.
You're saying is that it is an experience to breathe is to experience freedom, like at the most fundamental level of knowing. And I also want to, Joe has asked that he wanted to say something, so I want to give him a chance to come in. And I'm sorry, I have to keep putting my microphone on mic because my neighbor decided that this was the time to start doing some chainsaw work. So I'll put myself on mic and let Joe hop in with a question here.
I just, as Petri was talking back and forth with you, okay, well, anyway, here, the way that I think is the best way to approach what Petri's talking about is it's like meta breath work, you know. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, Petri, but what I think you're about is not breathing per se, and not breath work per se, and not pranayama per se, but, you know, but what I hear you talking about is really how we think about it, you know, that how we think about it, how we language it, how we view breathing, you know, just basic breathing, and then how we view breath work. That those views are that only by investigating your own view, your own philosophy, so to speak, even though for the most part it is unconscious. You know, every person has a philosophy of breathing. They just aren't conscious of it because they received it, because they were taught it, or they absorbed it from the culture. And so what I think we're talking about today, I think what I get from you, Petri, is talking about trying, you know, basically trying to tease apart the stories that we have about breathing that we think are facts, and they're not facts. They're stories that we have about breathing. And let me just finish with one way of explaining that. The author, Antonio Damasio, he's got several books, Self Comes to Mind, and The Feeling of What Happens, and so on. But he has a very interesting and unusual definition for the word image. Okay? You know, usually we think of image as a visual image, a picture, so on, perception, whatever. But his definition of image, he says that the way we experience the world, the way we experience ourselves, the way we experience breathing, we can only experience the images created by the brain. So you cannot directly experience anything other than the movie in your head. And that movie has many channels, many different, you know, it's multimedia. The movie that your brain creates, you know, it includes not only visuals, it includes sound, it includes touch, it includes smell, every single kind of, you know, sensory, whatever. He calls all of those images. And I think, you know, I think that the only way to really understand what Petri's talking about is that we have to understand that it's you know, it's kind of a radical inquiry. It's not like the breath inquiry that I teach. You know, when I teach a breath inquiry, I ask students to investigate the qualities of their breathing. And I think what Petri is asking us to do is to investigate the mental structures, perspectives, views, languaging, culture, like why do Hindus, when I have Hindu students, Indian students, they are eager and keen for anything having to do with breath. American students, not interested. Some are. The ones who are really interested, but they are the minority, whereas the majority of Indians, and I think it comes from this, cultural difference. And I was kind of, that's one of the things I'm really interested in is how did it get to be this way? But anyway, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole yet. I want to stick with.
So can you share a little bit, to clarify on what he's saying about, can you use what he's saying and sort of clarify where, your point of view on that? Because that's what he's saying. He's interpreting it as. Is that really where you're going with your work? Is that what when you're doing philosophical inquiry, is it at that deeper, more fundamental level?
It is on the more fundamental level, but it is on the more fundamental level in this way that we would get to a more fundamental level and more fundamental ways of seeing what are the dimensions of breathing, what are the possibilities of breathing, what things or what kind of let's say what kind of things or matters we could do with the breath that we have not even seen yet as possible. How the breath could become like a driving force or a guide, our new teacher, or if we want to use a Indian term, our guru, that could teach us a new way to live life. How the breath could become certain kind of a master of one's life, in a sense that you would learn all the time new things and new dimensions of, or new levels of what life could be about, because life is so deeply connected with the breath. Our living is so deeply connected with the breath. Our existential structure, our behavioral systems, our moral codes, our ways of thinking, our practical life is all connected so deeply with the breath that we don't even understand how deeply it is. The way to get connected with that is just to hold your breath, blow, and just see the experience of what happens with our thinking, what happens with our everyday life, with our social ways of being with other people, our practical ways of cooking or doing our work or whatever. If I hold my breath, none of that is anymore possible. Everything just turns very quickly into dreadful experience of anxiety. And that tells how fast it goes to this kind of levels of anxiety, is that actually whatever we are doing, there is always a respiratory meaning, a respiratory dimension, a respiratory or breathing atmosphere, a breathful atmosphere of whatever we are doing. So if I understood right what Joe was saying, that my philosophical breath work is not so much about the breath, but more about the thinking, or more about the mental structures or the cultural ways of seeing, and then questioning those. And then he also said about the stories about the breath that we are telling to ourselves. Yes, of course, in a certain way, this is very much what my philosophical breath work is about, but it's not at all in the first place about that. It is in the first place about how to put all of that aside for a moment and to experience that breath before you have conceptualized it as a Hindu way or the scientific way or the the Buddhist way or the New Age way or whatever breathwork vocabulary we have, is there a possibility of getting to that experience, that kind of primordial experience of the breath, or the fundamental experience of the breath that is not so much tainted yet, or seeing from certain kind of glasses, like the Hindu glasses or the Western scientific glasses or so on. So this is where this is connected very deeply with the philosophical tradition that I come from, which is Western idea of phenomenological philosophy, which always starts by placing in abeyance or putting out of play whatever conceptual frameworks we have, and then try to get to the original experience and start to learn to think and behave from that perspective or that experience of that original experience. And in this case, it would be the breath. So, for example,
it's so interesting that you can have this, like, you know, like what you're saying to me is just, you know, we don't think about the fact that because we are always breathing, that we can always experience our breath, and that it is also shaping our experience. Like, to me, it was just to start to notice how I shape my experience through, you know, even unconsciously manipulating the breath or changing my state of breath. You know, it's a very interesting inquiry just to be aware of, like, oh yeah, if I feel sad, what's happening with my breathing versus when I feel happy, or just, you know, like what happens then the vice versa. If I start to change my breath, what happens, you know, in my body with the mood. It's so basic to come to that level of inquiry because it's there all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm sorry I interrupted you, but I just
those things which are there all the time and which we take the most for most granted are the most difficult. They are kind of the most simple, and for that reason, because they are so simple or so much that which our life is about, that's why they are so difficult. And in the case of breath, because it is connected with this invisible atmosphere, it is way more difficult to get connected with that in our normal way of behaving in our everyday life, because we are so much used to connected with those objects that we can see, other people that we can see or touch. So it's like we are kind of grabbing here like the nothing. And that is what is also important in the breath, is that that breath is in a certain way nothing. Or breath is connected in a certain way to nothing of air, because if we take in our everyday experience, how we are used to connected with the world is that we come to a room which there is nothing, no object. We say, okay, there is nothing in this room. Or we come to and we say the room is empty. So we can talk about emptiness of air or nothingness of air. And the only way we can be in that room, even if it is in a normal, say, way empty of all things or other people, is that there is this air, this emptiness of air, nothingness of air, which then makes it possible that we can be there. And this, for example, is connected, in my opinion, deeply with what, for example, the Buddhists are talking about, the emptiness or nothingness, or the Christian mystics or any kind of form of mystics are talking about God as nothing or God as emptiness. And why in this kind of wisdom traditions, breath is so important is that with the breathing experience, we get connected straight away with that nothingness or that emptiness. And so that's why, for example, in the Buddhist tradition, in my view, if we go back to that kind of basic experience and we kind of put all the Buddhist normal vocabularies and normal interpretations of their whole hundreds and hundreds of years of tradition of interpreting Buddha's words in different kind of schools of Buddhism, we try to put them also aside for a moment and try to connect those original words and thinking of them connected with the breath. Of like, because also the tradition of the Buddhism says in their traditional text that Buddha got enlightened or attained nirvana through anapanasati, the mindfulness of breathing practice. So how then, what does it mean that we are breathing? What does it mean in this kind of mindfulness of breathing practice is that we become mindful, we become more conscious of that emptiness, this experience of empty air which comes to us and fills us. We become part of that emptiness. We are sharing or in relationship with going in and going out of emptiness of air. Okay, we can come back to this point later, but I want to still say something about this story.
Yeah, go ahead. And then I want to see if Joe also wanted to jump in.
But I want to comment first on Joe's, when he said stories about breathing. And this is we have these ready-made stories that we are telling about breathing in different kind of traditions, on different kind of perspectives. We have the scientific story of breathing, we have the Buddhist story of breathing, and so on. And the thing is that we very often tell these kind of ready-made stories that somebody else has told us, and then we start to tell those stories to ourselves and to our friends and other people, and then we interpret our experiences through those stories. But in philosophical breathwork, we are trying to put also put out of play for a moment these ready-made stories and start to wonder, is it possible to learn from the breath new stories? Could we learn new ways of making conceptualizations or new words of what does it mean to be a breathing person? What does it mean to be breathing connected with other people? How is it connected to our experience of space, time, community, freedom, peace, our everyday practical ways of living, our conversations? How is it happening here? And there I can bring to the conversation also one of the great thinkers of breathing, Gaston Bachelard, who has this book about air and dreams. Because for Gaston Bachelard, he divides poets as the creators of new stories, as creators of new words, the creators of new images, as Joe was pointing towards the images. Like he divides poets to 4 different kind of basic poets, and he goes them with the question of elemental elemental, like the element of air, the element of water, the element of fire, and the element of earth. And there are these poets that are either aerial poets, if they are the poets of the air. Then there is the poets of fire, the poets of earth, and the poets of water. And the question for then the poet is, what is the most fundamental source of inspiration, the most fundamental that moves one's creativity, and how one could learn as this kind of elemental poet, learn to listen and become a follower of that your own form of element. And so how in a certain way, Bachelard talks about that, if we talk about the aerial poets, the poets of the air, is that the air itself has an imagination. The air itself dreams, and it dreams within us, it imagines within us. And then the poet's idea, or the poet's task, is to learn to listen that imagination of the air, the imagination of the elemental forces, and to put that in words, to learn to find new words, to find new stories, to find new ways of dreaming with that air. So that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that actually, there's a couple of things that reminds me of. One of them is there's scientist actually who he's on YouTube. He did a TED Talk that was sort of the banned TED Talk because they were people who were not really speaking strictly scientifically, I guess. But one of the things that he talked about was this idea of sort of a consciousness existing outside of us and something that we participate in, which that very much sounds like, where rather than as something that we're creating out of our brains and our lived individual experience, that we're participating in consciousness as a bigger experience. Sorry, my neighbor is like making so much noise.
I can't hear it.
I'm glad to hear that it's not coming through the mic. And then the other thing is that, that this experience also, that we participate in breath together. And so to me, it's also a communal experience because, for example, you talk about that empty room. Well, if that room were filled with a group of people and I've had this experience, people meditating, then we're all sharing through the air with each other. One person's expiring breath, and then that becomes part of another person's inspiration. And so it also can be part of a communal experience to breathe.
Indeed, very much so. It's a communal experience. And so one of the atmospheres of breathing then becomes this kind of like, what kind of community or communion with other people we all the time have when we are breathing, when we are sharing the breath together. And it's not only with other human beings, but we are breathing the out breath of the dogs and all kinds of animals, and we are also breathing the out breath of all people that we don't like. We are sharing, like even the most horrible person, it might be if they are in the same room with us or in the bus with us, we are sharing that, and it becomes extremely intimate experience. Or normally, of course, we are not conscious of it and we are totally unaware of it. But think about that air that I just breathe out, it goes into the very depths of other person's being. And also the other people that perhaps we don't like at all, we are really getting their air, their bad breath or whatever, very deep in ourselves. And so we are conspiring together. So this is an important word. The word conspiration or conspiracy originally etymologically means to breathe together. And so also one thing which is important in philosophical breathwork is to become conscious of all kinds of words that originally have meant breath, and then to start to think about why is it that they mean now something completely different, or is there perhaps some kind of a deep connection between the meaning of what we have it now and the original meaning. And there is a certain kind of, for example, about this conspiration, I would say normally conspiracy is a certain kind of secret plot behind the scenes, like powerful people are for economic or political or whatever religious reasons trying to manipulate people. So in a sense, there is a conspiracy also of breath, or in a more fundamental level, because most of the people are not at all conscious that they are part of something that is happening behind the scenes that they are not conscious of all, because they are concentrated on other things. And happily there is this conspiracy, because that conspiracy is keeping us alive and making it possible that in our lives we can then put our efforts and goals into other things which we seem to be thinking are extremely important. But we couldn't do that if there wouldn't be that conspiracy of breathing happening all the time behind the scenes. And the way is to become conscious of that and to become like a fundamental conspirator to that conspiracy, to really start to participate in it and start to see how it connects us with all the people and what are the possibilities and what we could learn from this community that is already all the time happening. And could that teach us a new way to live together, where we are connected in this kind of peaceful way, which is not run or ruled by any rulers, or there is no thought leaders of what to do. We are all breathing, and when we came out of mother's womb, the first thing we did, we started to breathe. And so the moment we started to breathe, we were connected and taken part of that common conspiracy, that community of breathers. And
yeah, that's incredible.
Nobody can be excluded from it, at least very easily. So it doesn't look for what race we are, what education we are, what kind of ideology we are part of, what kind of language we are speaking, what nationality we are. So it excludes, it is like totally inclusive. Nobody is excluded if you are a breathing person or a breathing being. So that could also create, and if we could really listen to that, it could make us a completely new way of thinking what life is, how we're connected with other people, and so on.
So may I?
Bersi, yes, please, Jeff.
I would like to, I'd like to introduce an earth element into our conversation. Mm-hmm. I'd like to sort of ground. I'd like to ground this whole thing with two things. I want to say them up front so I don't forget to do one or the other. Number one, I want to talk about how you and I met, and number two, I want to talk about the practical application of what you're talking about to climate change. Okay, so let me start with how you and I met, because we introduced you, but I just would like to say that I met Petri in I guess that was 2015, 3 years ago, at Kripalu at the conference called, and I'll try to get it correctly this time, Petri, Breath Immersion from the Science to the Samadhi. And Petri was one of the presenters. I don't know if you would know this, Petri, but the only way I was there, the only way I got to go, was that Jessica Inspiration Community gave me for free a ticket to go in exchange for my helping them. And so for the entire conference, I was on stage off to the side running the tape recorder. I'm not, I did other stuff too. But anyway, what I wanted to get to was, I don't know if you remember this or not, Petri, but at the very end, the very last day, everybody said one thing, or one thing that they got from the conference. And I remember standing there and looking out, and I said, what I got most of all was the connection, was the deep connection I have felt over the last days with, it didn't happen with everyone at the conference, but I said with a lot of the people here, and you know who you are. And then I looked around the room and I looked at Petri, because Petri was, from the first moment I met Petri, he was like this light bulb, crazy young guy, irrepressible. Trying to stop Petri once he gets talking is like jumping in front of a freight train. I'm really happy that you and I have reconnected and that we finally get to actually talk about this stuff. Okay, so the second point is, I don't know about where you live, but around here, Baltimore, Baltimore, Maryland, this is the watershed. All of the water here drains into the Chesapeake Bay. And, you know, when you're walking down the street, sidewalk in Baltimore, a lot of times the manhole covers for the storm drains, where the rainwater goes in, they have it painted on the manhole cover. It says, drainage to the Chesapeake Bay. You know, and it's a way of making people conscious that if they pour lacquer thinner, if they pour gasoline, if they pour their garbage down that drain, they are pouring it into the Chesapeake Bay. Okay? So, you know, the consciousness of pollution, the consciousness of not polluting, the consciousness of being responsible for what your action does downstream, literally, I think is the application of what you're talking about co-breathing. Because when, you know, if everyone were conscious of the fact that we co-breathe with the trees, the plants, the planet, we co-breathe with every living thing on the planet, that we would have a much harder time ignoring climate change and ignoring the effects of our actions if it were viscerally as a phenomenon in our body. That it's, you know, and again, I think because of our mechanistic scientific viewpoint on breathing, that we don't think that way, because we think in terms of anatomy, physiology, almost like breathing as a closed system. You know, I mean, blood is a closed system. Blood is a closed system inside the body. Breathing is not a closed system, it's an open system. And I think that if you're conscious that you are co-breathing, that is, you know, it's not just me breathing right now. You know, it's even incorrect technically to say I am breathing my air. It ain't my air, and it's not really my breathing. So I, you know, anyway, I'm in a long-winded way, I'm trying to say that consciousness of breathing can contribute to the practical application in terms of, like, you know, being responsible for the effect that human activity is having on the planet. Does that make sense? Petri?
Okay. So the question of responsibility and the question of ethics and the question of breath as the open system, we can now, in connection to all of this, talk about the ethics of breathing. And when you bring the question of, I would say that breath is one way of learning totally new ethics, totally new style of life, totally new way of behaving in the world, totally new way to understand responsibility. And for example, if we take the question of responsibility, we need to take the word very literally here. The ability to respond is where the word responsibility comes from. And when you are consciously practicing your breath, you are every moment, when you are cultivating your breath in the breathing practice, for example, in mindfulness of breathing, you are responding every moment to that breath. So you could take it as a practice of growing or cultivating your responsibility, how to respond to everything that happens. And the breath is happening all the time, how to become more conscious of that. And then it also could be a practice of this co-breathing in the ethical sense. I have written about in one book, which is here. This book also came out in 2018, now in April. This is a book called Borders and Debordering. It's a book about philosophy of hospitality. And hospitality is, of course, one deep question of ethics. How we welcome the other, how we see the other, how we respond to the other. So what kind of ability to respond as responsibility we have for others, other people, the nature, animals, everything that is happening. And then finally the question of air around us, which then comes to us. And I have invented there a new concepts of hospitality. I talk about aerial hospitality and respiratory hospitality. And if we would understand this question of hospitality, of welcoming the other in a new way from as a practice of ethics in connection to cultivation of breathing, this would bring perhaps totally different kind of ethics and this kind of like attitude towards the planet and to nature, is that we are, first of all, there is aerial hospitality, which is a pure gift from the air. The air is totally hospitable towards us. It doesn't care at all. Normally, if we are hospitable towards other people, we have conditions of hospitality normally. I bring you, you can come to my house if I like you, or you have a certain kind of, I want to at least know your name. I want to know that you don't have bad intentions. I don't invite to my home anybody from the street. So we normally, we have all kinds of conditions, and countries have all kinds of conditions of who they welcome over their borders. Of course, one important thing connected to this is that air does not have any borders. There is no borders in the air. So the air itself is totally has totally unconditional hospitality. It doesn't. It gives us a gift that we can be here. The air allows us all the time to be here. It doesn't condition us depending on our race or what I already mentioned is that it doesn't. It includes us whatever we are. Even the bad people or the people that we would think that are totally immoral or totally criminal or racist or whatever. The air is so hospitable that it even gives air to them. It gives place for them. So there is something that we could perhaps learn, is that if I could become, what could I learn from this kind of hospitality? Then another level of this is that and this is connected then to the spiritual practices of meditation, for example. Non-judgmental attitude is the same way air doesn't have any kind of judgments about others. It just welcomes. It is pure welcoming. Is like how perhaps this could transcend my personal ethics of how I see good and bad, because air is beyond good and bad. In a certain way, this would be a new way of understanding Nietzsche's ethics of going beyond good and bad, or beyond good and evil. This idea is from Bachelard. Bachelard, in this book, Air and Dreams, talks about Nietzsche's ethics, and he calls a possibility of aerial ethics, which would be this kind of new way of going beyond good and bad, or good and evil. And it would be like Nietzsche is connected very often with total transmutation of all values, total revaluation of all values. So this kind of aerial ethics could be a total revaluation of all values, because we start to think them, whatever our ethical concern is, we would think of it, what would air do? What could air as this fundamental, invisible, life-giving atmosphere could teach us about it? Then there is the respiratory hospitality. Is this that normally there are human hosts and human guests, and the human host invites and welcomes the human guest to his house. But in order that this can happen, is that both the human host and the human guest, they are both respiratory hosts, because they are hosting into their lungs. They are like, normally in hospitality, we talk about welcoming with open arms. So in breathing, we could see that breathing actually could be seen as welcoming with open lungs. So we take this totally mysterious air that we have to welcome, but we could take it as a certain kind of welcoming practice of like how I could, as best as possible way, as friendly way, as welcoming way, invite this aerial stranger, this aerial guest, this atmosphere into my lungs, and make it feel as comfortable inside me. And then as a good host also gives a great welfare of saying goodbye to the guest, and makes the guest feel as good as possible from that, when he was in or she was in the in my place. So how I could release and get that air to feel as good as possible when it's coming out from me.
And I'm going to put that, I think that would just be an amazing technique to literally sit and focus simply on the experience of welcoming the breath in, and then, you know, saying goodbye to the breath as it departs. You know, just if people want to have like one practice that they take from this to just discover, you know, something that they can actually experience, like, to me, that would just be such a simple and beautiful experience to sit and just say, you know, every breath, completely welcome it in, and then give it this loving send off as it leaves us. I do want us to start wrapping this up because we have been talking for a while and I want to keep it concise, but I would like to invite you to come back again and talk with us about these ideas of philosophy of hospitality related to this fundamental experience of breath, because I think that is just an incredible topic like that. I was like, okay, can we just go for another hour on that? Because I think it's really incredible to think about relating your ideas of, you know, how do you relate to other people through what you can learn through your breath. So I hope that you will consider returning again.
I will definitely want to return if I'm invited. That would be honored to be again with you.
Yes.
But before you want to wrap up this thing, we completely forgot, we didn't speak a word about our new book.
Yeah, so that was my next question. So can you share with us, can you share us your book? So go ahead and speak so that the camera turns to you.
Okay, so our new book, which was, as this hospitality book was published in 2018 in April, just 2 months ago. So also this book, Atmospheres of Breathing, which I co-edited with professor of philosophy, a Slovenian professor, Lenart Škof. So this also came out in April 2018. So a lot of things have been happening in April 2018. By the way, this hospitality book was also, one of the co-editors was the professor Lenart Škof. So Lenart Škof is a great thinker and philosopher of breathing. He's one of the only philosophers in the whole world who is, with me, thinking the question of breath as the most fundamental question. And he has a book, Proximity of Breath, which came 2015 out. I recommend everybody to take a look and read Lenart Škof's book on breath, this proximity of breath. I never remember.
On the YouTube replay, I'll put links below to all these books that have been mentioned so that you can see them and find them.
I never remember is the book's name Proximity of Breath or Breath of Proximity. But anyway, so this book, that Atmospheres of Breathing, that now came in April out, has 17 articles. It is the first anthology of breathing. So 17 articles written by 17 different philosophers. And the topics of this book on breath, this philosophical book on breath, is wide variety of things that people have very rarely thought in connection to breathing or connected to this thought within this atmosphere of breathing. And the topics, for example, are the theater of breathing, aesthetics of breathing, feminism of breathing, environmental philosophy of breathing, poetics of breathing or poetry of breathing, then philosophical view to mindfulness of breathing in Buddhist tradition, then yoga philosophy of breathing or pranayama connected to the French philosopher Merleau-Ponty, who is the most important bodily philosopher of this phenomenological tradition from where I come from. Then there is chapter on ethics of breathing. Then it has my chapter on ontology of breathing, how the question of breathing is connected deeply with question of being and our being in the world and different ways of being, and how it's connected to the questions of nothingness and invisibility and so on. Then there is let's see if I forgot something. Then there is a chapter on the qi of breathing. So Chinese philosophy, understanding how the qi as breath has been understood. Then there is a medical philosophy of breathing chapter. Then there is a chapter on Japanese thinking of ki and its connection to philosophy and medicine in the Japanese culture. Then it has media of breathing, how the question of breath mediates all kinds of things and how through it we could understand normal ways how we understand media as mass media and so on. Then there is politics of breathing. Then there is the question of breathlessness, how the experience of breathlessness could be understood from the experiential level as a philosophical question compared to only seeing breathlessness and all kinds of asthma attacks and so on from medical perspective. Then there is the question of pre-Socratics of breath. So how in the Western culture before Socrates and Plato, the pre-Socratics like Heraclitus and Anaximenes understood the question of breath and air. So it has plenty of all kinds of different kind of vocabularies and ways to understand the breath and to use Joe's stories about breathing. So this book offers totally new kinds of ways how to tell these stories about the breath and how to start to learn to tell different kind of stories about the breath of what we are normally used to, which will of course expand our way of life.
Fascinating how you've covered, such a range of topics from the pre-Socratic philosophers to, Eastern philosophy. You have chi, ki, prana, all these different, it just sounds like a wonderful thing to sit down and think about all these different new ways to explore the breath. I want to give Joe a chance to say goodbye to you, and then we'll wrap this up. I want to let people know that, first of all, please like and share the video, which will be here. We're going to put links down below to Petri. We also have an introductory chapter of his book available. We will have the link below to access that, or below on the replay. So please do that. It really helps us if you subscribe to the channel, you like it, you share it. That helps it to get promoted to more people, and we really want more people to be aware of Petri's work, because I think it's great that he's doing it, and an important inquiry. And I can see that you wanted to say a little more, so I'll let you say that, and then we'll let Joe also say something.
So from the link you can find and download for free the introductory chapter that I wrote with Lenart Škof to our book. And the motto of that introductory chapter comes from Nobel Literature Prize winner Elias Canetti. And I love just that quote so much. And the whole introduction chapter is thinking about and trying to inquire what his quote, his words could mean. And those words are, "It is not enough to think. One also has to breathe. Dangerous are the thinkers who have not breathed enough." So this is like how to really learn to think with the breath, according to breath, in collaboration with the breath, in the atmosphere of breath, anything we have in our life in a new way, how to see the world in a new way, to see it in a breathful way, to see it in a respiratory way, to really create new respiratory philosophy. That's what I want to share with everyone.
And last thing I'd like to say is I just discovered that, I mean, the book is $95, you know. Mm-hmm. I just saw that there's actually a Kindle version and a Google Play version. I don't know how much they cost yet, but I think that people should be aware that there is also Kindle version and Amazon Play version, as well as the brick version.
For some weird reason, the Kindle version, at least what I last time looked, is even more expensive than the hard, the real one. So, and I don't know when will the paperback version come.
Okay. Thanks, Petri, and love you, and hope to see you again. I hope to see you in person again. Bye.
It was so fantastic to be with both of you, to talk with you, and I am so happy that we talked and you invited me to have a chance to be with you. And if you really want to invite me again, I would be thrilled about it. So thank you so much. Bye-bye.
You're muted, Suzanne.
Yes, Suzanne is muted.
I wanted to say that, first of all, thank you.
Can I say something?
Sure.
So the place was the silence, which always, of course, needs to come with the breath, because as Bachelard, for example, says, breath is the most fundamental level of silence. It is. And in the most fundamental level, the silence, the true silence, is the silence that breathes. It is not the silence of graveyards or sorrow. It is the silence of joyfulness of breath, of the happiness of breath, and what that breath can bring to us as an explosion experience of like what all things we can do with it, and how happy we could be with it, that it has allowed us to be part of this atmosphere. Thank you.
You can thank my neighbor who was chainsawing the entire time that we were recording this. So thank you so much. It was wonderful. And it was saying that you were definitely, we'll have you back. And I have a call in a minute, so I'll message you and we'll arrange that. And then I also just want to say, as a philosophy major, and I don't get to talk philosophy very much anymore, it was just really wonderful to explore these philosophical ideas of, you know, these fundamental philosophical questions about our existence and our coexistence together. Thank you so much for bringing your wisdom to us. And we look for you who are watching on the replay to comment and like and share on the video so that we can learn more about what you would like to hear from Petri next time he's on. So thank you. Thank you so much, Petri.
Thank you.